Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And although this is part of RAF Week, today's show actually encompasses the RAF, US Army Air Force, the French Resistance, and the Royal Navy. The Shelburne line is a subject of express delivery, which is this book here. I have my copy here by my guest, Keith Janes, who also maintains a detailed website about that story. Just before I bring Keith in, if you're new to the channel, and we've had about 1,000 new subscribers in the last 7 or 8 days, which is fantastic. Please don't forget that all the information you need is in that description below. You can open it up and you'll find links to my guests' websites. You'll find links to our merchandise, our social media links, etc., etc. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Keith in. Good evening, Keith. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
So I think I said something on Twitter this afternoon. I think everybody who knows anything about World War II is aware they were escape lines. I think it's something that's quite common knowledge. The details of how they were set up and how they were run, I think, is beyond some of these people. But in your case, before you start delivering your presentation, how did you get interested in the Shelburne line? What was your route to examining this particular story?
The Shelburne is a bit complicated, but I started with my dad. He died in 1998. The following year, I discovered diaries that he'd kept of his time in France, something which I knew next to nothing about. Turns out he was a soldier. Well, I did know that, but he was captured at the very beginning of the war, Saint-Brieuc, escaped or was rescued, depends on your point of view, 10 days later, and was sheltered in the part of Calais for 16 months before being brought south by what was then known as the Organisation, later the Pat O'Leary line, all the way through to Marseille and across the Pyrenees. Now, the story is not unique. I mean, 4,000 odd British troops were captured at St. Valery. Several hundred escaped subsequently, made their way south generally. I'm sure he wasn't the only one to keep a diary, but I think his diaries are the only ones that have actually survived. So that's how I got into it in the first place. I typed out the diaries and I did a bit of research, discovered the Pat line, which I'd never heard of, that his guides were Roland Lepeur, Harold Cole, that the man who sheltered him in Marseille was Louis Nouveau. And the fact that the diaries survived is because he left the diaries with Louis Nouveau.
Wow.
The diaries story is actually more unique than my dad's by far. Nouveau was arrested in February 43, sent to Buchenwald, which he was lucky to survive. But one of the first things he seems to have done when he got home was post the diaries back to my dad in England.
Wow. I mean, because that's the thing is, when I have someone on the channel who has been writing about an RAF squadron or a British Army unit, there are obviously official archives, there are war diaries, there are records you can search. The very success of an escape line or a resistant network is dependent on no one knowing really who anyone else is and knowing a minimum about it. So when people start researching it post-war, I mean, I guess there's lots of kind of dead ends that you can't get to because there's a lot of hidden information.
You need a lot of background. It takes a bit of practice. The guides and Louis Nouveau were fairly easy to identify by then. Harold Cole's obviously become infamous. Roland Lepeur is known. And Louis Nouveau ran probably the most famous safe house in escape line history. And my dad's recorded on the list of visitors at his flat. In fact, he's technically number 2, I think. Although it's not strictly true because Louis Nouveau's early records aren't 100%.
Right.
But I think my dad set a precedent, and I just followed that up. So started with the Pat line, done that for years, still am. It's an incredibly complicated story. Met lots of evaders, lots of helpers, made lots of contacts, followed escape routes, mostly across the Pyrenees, although I've done other parts of France, his journey via Abbeville and all the rest of it. And it's just gone on and on. So published the diaries, Conscript Heroes, and then launched the website. And that was mostly Pat line, plus other people were sending me stuff. So I posted some of that. Some of it was brilliant. And then escapelines.com as a sort of subsidiary to it, which is everything but the Pat line. And it's, as you know, it's got a lot of information. So basic stuff. If you want to know about escape lines, it's a good place to start.
Yeah, and the website links in the description below. And my way of finding you is Mag and I happened to find ourselves in Brittany last October, kind of winding down the season, went away for the weekend, and found ourselves near this beach. Saw these informational panels, memorials, and it rang a few bells of things I read about. And then I reached out, found your website, reached out to you, bought the book, and here we are. So we do have some images to come up later on from my visit there, and we'll have some maps later on. But basically, I'm going to hand over to Keith to kind of take us through this story. You may have some questions, folks, about specific details Keith is bringing up as we go along, or you may have broader questions about how escape lines worked in general. We can kind of cover that at the end, but there are a lot of names and details and places in this. So I'm going to hand over to Keith to begin, and then when you need the map, Keith, just let me know. But over to you. Let's learn about the Shelburne line.
Okay, well, I'll start with an overview of escape lines because I'm assuming most viewers don't know very much about them. So they can be described as organizations that help stranded servicemen get home. People who work the escape lines are simply known as helpers. Totally inadequate word, but that's what we use. They varied. Some escape lines were huge and most of them were quite small. Local people working together to help any stranded serviceman they found. The ultimate escape lines would find them, gather them in from surrounding areas, feed them, shelter them, give them false documents, etc., and ultimately get them out of the country. So servicemen themselves could have been escapers, men who had been captured, but others couldn't be escaped, or evaders, men who'd never been captured. For the escape line people, it's of academic interest. They were parcels. They'd done their heroic bit. Anybody who took off in a bomber, well, he deserves you taking your hat off to them. Their life expectancy was severely limited. Once on the ground, they're out of their element. They're a danger to everybody around them. So those are the kind of risks that the helpers took. If they got caught, they would be shot or at least deported, which could often result in the same kind of thing. So the stakes are high. It's a personal war as far as those concerned. The escapers, the guys who got home, well, it must have been a miracle their families found them, delivered to their doorstep way beyond their expectation. But for the helpers themselves, mostly unknown, mostly unremembered, and taking terrible risks for complete strangers. So that's why I do it. A lot of people help my dad. I have their names, I have a lot of their addresses, I've met some of the few survivors, and I'm forever grateful to them. And people like them, they deserve all the respect that we can give them.
And I'm glad you're starting it from the ground up as well, because I think we tend to look back on the war from the end of the war and go back to the beginning. And I think when you look at things like the escape lines, I think a lot of people's focus is on maybe the latter part of the war when everything gets a little bit more organized. Not necessarily less dangerous or any more successful, but MI9 and everyone else starts getting involved in it. But very much the beginning, as you said yourself there, and we've had other shows, it is individuals stepping up without any support, just wanting to help other people. And so it starts off a very much kind of I don't want to say amateur project, but an unofficial local level thing that gets more and more organized as the war goes on. And I think reminding ourselves it had very humble beginnings before it got to the kind of the 44, 45 era, I think is worth doing. But anyway, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, the people who helped my dad initially, he was captured at St. Valery, as I say, escaped or was rescued, depending on your point of view, 10 days later, sheltered. He was pulled from a POW line by two cousins, two young girls, sheltered by a family in Saint-Brieuc, and then moved to the wife's sister's house in O'Shell, where he stayed for the next, total of 16 months. These people were just ordinary people. Well, I say ordinary, they're extraordinary people. And O'Shell and that surrounding area was full of people like this. There were dozens of British soldiers stashed away in various households who left at various times and made their way south. My dad hung around longer than most, but not that he didn't set any records. These people are just extraordinary. I mean, would you do that? It's a question you have to ask yourself. And I think the reality is most of us would not take those risks for a complete stranger who didn't even speak your language.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, we're going down a rabbit hole very early, folks, but it does, when people often make kind of a harsh judgment about an occupied country, say, oh, they were collaborators, they just bowed to the occupiers' rules and regulations. And of course, the Vichy government is aligned with the Nazis, but that doesn't mean individual French people and Belgian people around occupied didn't just do their own thing and ignore what was happening around them. And I think any reminder that there were lots of people across France and other countries who were willing to put their lives on the line, I think is a good thing, because I think we make these generalized sweeping statements about people in occupied countries that are not nuanced enough to cover the range of activities going on by people who are under the Nazi occupation. But anyway, I'm going down one of my rabbit holes, but then people can have a drink. That's great. So back to you.
Yeah, I do the same sort of thing myself. Don't worry about it. Okay, let's get on to escape lines themselves. There were three. Oh, you've got your map. You've got your escape lines map, which everybody has. Another one, the one that other viewers use.
I haven't got it ready. I can maybe find it, but that's the one I've got at the moment.
Oh, not to worry. There were three major escape lines running through France. Everybody will tell you that, but they then get them wrong. The Pat O'Leary line, originally the organisation, the people that helped my father, that ran from the very beginning of the war, based in Lille, and then made contact with Marseille eventually, and joined the two up. And that's the general scope of the O'Leary line. They also branched out into Brittany for a while, but it didn't go terribly well. So that's what they're famous for. Second one is Comet, the Belgian organisation, which started up in the spring of 41, bringing people from Holland and Belgium down through Paris, but then Bordeaux and the extreme western end of the Pyrenees across from Bayonne, Saint-Jean-de-Luz. And then the third one is Burgundy, the French BCRA Bourgogne line, which nobody seemed to know much about. But I thought about it a few years ago and realized there's a big gap in our experiences, in our knowledge, rather. An awful lot of men getting back via escape lines, but what escape line? They weren't Pat, they weren't Comet, they weren't Dutch Paris, they weren't anything. They were Burgundy. So that's how I wrote my first book, which is about the Burgundy line. And then there was Shelburne, which is completely different. There were other organizations, by the way, smaller ones. What we got? John Carter, Bordeaux Lupiac, Jean-Marie, Marie-Claire, Mary Odile, Dutch Paris, Possum, Françoise Dizard, of course. They were on a slightly smaller scale. The other three are the major lines. Right, moving on to Shelburne. Let's put it in context, between July 40 and August 44, we had about 1,500 military evaders, including about 500 American aircrew across the Pyrenees. Some of them in the early days of the war were easy treks. I mean, you or I could do them fairly easily, and I have done several times. But after the German takeover of France in November 42, border security increased, and they started having to use much harder Central Pyrenees routes. Now, they are a challenge, believe me. Even in good weather, some of these high mountain routes take days and nights to complete. I've done quite a few of them, but always in daylight, always in summer, and even then some of them have been snowed off. I mean, they are horrendous or potentially horrendous. So basically, there had to be a better way. Now, Shelburne only existed for a few months. In that short time, they brought back 100 evaders, including 89 American aircrew, over 2 months, 5 Bonaparte operations. I know there were a few more on the Crozier ops, but that's a separate issue. So Shelburne based itself, can trace its origins back to Pat O'Leary. I'll get back to Pat a lot here. First of the major escape lines. They organised 2 sea evacuations in 1942 from Plage, which is just outside Perpignan. And they organised the SOE, SIS boats that were running agents backwards and forwards from Gibraltar. Seawolf and Sea Dog, Polish crews for Lucas, picked up 42 military evaders in 2 operations from the beach there. So that set the precedent. And including Lucien Dumay and Val Williams, both were picked up from Plage. So they had experience of sea evacuations. So the seed was there. Everybody knew that going by sea was a great idea. It's a hell of a lot easier than walking across the Pyrenees. You can take my word for that. So in 43, MI9 tried to set up the Oak Tree line, which is Val Williams and Ray LaBrosse. Now, Val Williams had worked with the Pat line, so he had form, he had experience. He'd lived in France for many years, technically born in Moscow, but brought up in the States and then moved back to France. And Ray LaBrosse, who was a young Canadian Army radio operator. And the idea was similar to Shelburne. They would set up an organization in Paris. They would gather evaders. They would take them to Brittany. They based themselves in Brittany at Saint-Brieuc, which is just down the road from Pleuc. And they, as far as I know, there was no link to Pleuc or between Pleuc and Oak Tree, completely separate organizations and people and all the rest of it. Unfortunately, the Oak Tree mission did not go well. They started off late. They couldn't be landed by Lysander. Weather was dreadful. They were finally parachuted in. They trashed their radios and half their equipment. By the time they got themselves set up in Paris, with Paul Campinci, incidentally, amongst other contacts, and then established themselves in St. Kay, and had brought numerous evaders to Brittany, the nights were too short. The gunboats couldn't get there and back under cover of darkness, and everybody went across the Pyrenees, including Ray LaBrosse, with Burgoyne. So that was the end of Oak Tree, but the idea was good. So Shelburne was modelled on the same idea. Let's try it again. And they incorporated Ray LaBrosse as radio operator, but the second time around, they appointed Lucien Dumais as the organizer. And this was a much better idea, as you can imagine. So, 3 basic requirements for a sea evacuation line using gunboats. First problem, find yourself a gunboat. Not so straightforward. As you probably know, you've done your research. Gunboats progressed in abilities. They had been used throughout the war from the very beginning. Gunboats, yachts, fishing boats, all sorts of sea-going vessels were going backwards and forwards to France. But it wasn't until 843 that the Admiralty, or whoever you want to claim as responsible, set up a 15 motor gunboat flotilla, specifically to ferry agents backwards and forwards. Based in Dartmouth in Devon, they'd had a lot of experience. They were mostly using MGB 318, a C-class boat. And that was what they planned to use for Shelburne. But by the time Shelburne got underway, they had the new new boats, 502, 503, much bigger, much more seaworthy, much faster, diesel engines, the whole bit. They were the business.
But as you say, because they're much faster, much more powerful, there's lots of tasks that gunboats are wanted for in 43, 44. And that's the kind of it's that era where everything that the Allies need to do things that are coming up, even such simple things as gliders and landing craft, there's always a shortage. So when something becomes good at what it does, there's needs for them everywhere. So you know, MI9 and getting escaping airmen out of Europe is one need, but there are lots of other needs.
I would have thought getting aircrew out was pretty low set of priorities.
Exactly. Yeah, I was going to politely say it's quite low on the list. Yeah.
Yes, I think it was. SOE and SIS had an urgent requirement for getting agents in. SOE had set up their VAR line by this time, and that was operating using, well, in theory, using the same boats. And of course, you can only use a gunboat on a moonless night, the exact opposite of the Lysanders and the Hudsons that were doing the ferrying trips backwards and forwards with agents. So very limited time frame, also weather dependent. So the demand was there, and the boats only had a limited amount of time each month that they could operate. So I think Shelburne was very lucky to be able to slot in end of January to the end of March and get 5 ops in by themselves. They didn't do much with agents. They were almost exclusively for stranded airmen. So what the priority, how those priorities were decided, I just don't know. 2 agents were delivered on Bonaparte 4, but that was very much the exception to the rule.
Okay.
Right, you need a gunboat. Then you need an organisation, somewhere that you can gather your can find your evaders, shelter them, feed them, clothe them, get false ration tickets, passes, identity cards, the whole bit. You need guides. You need all sorts of things. And then the third thing you need is a beach. And that wasn't as easy as anything either. I mean, Oak Tree tried to use some Cape Horteur, but that really wasn't a great idea. And nobody even tried to land a gunboat there. But Pleuc turned out to be the place. So what do we get to? Yeah, we've covered a bit of SIS were using gunboats, of course, as well, and bringing back evaders. Aberbenwat estuary, the dot on the far left, top left, is supposed to be around about the Aberbenwat estuary. And Pierre Hentic was running his SIS operations centered on there. And gunboats were supplying him with information, with stores, money, etc., and taking back information. So the route was set up. They had gunboats going backwards and forwards. Beaches were organised, but he got stuck with a load of evaders as well at the last moment. In November, he was tasked with taking a load of evaders that were being sheltered in around Brest. There's a big organisation there who had a number of evaders, which they'd originally been shipping out via Bordeaux-Lupiac, but that was blown apart with the death of the organizer, Jean-Claude Camot and Remy Roy, being injured. So they didn't know what to do with these people. And at the last minute, they hijacked, if you like, Pierre Hentic's boats and ran operations out of the Aberbenwat estuary. They're a story in themselves. I mean, I've written the whole thing as an article, immensely complicated, but it got the job done in the end, at the end of December, using the same gunboats, 318. And a borrowed boat for that one. So at the same time, as we've already mentioned, SOE you had set up VAR, and that was operating further east, originally from St. Cast, which is a fair few miles east of Pleuc, etc., just near St. Malo. And then when an operation there went pear-shaped on Christmas Eve 43, they moved to Beg and Fry, which is on the map, second circle in from the left, middle of nowhere, and they operated from there for several months into 44. So the same gunboats, again, mostly 502, sorry. 503 did most of the ops for MI9 to Bonaparte Beach, and 502, which was the senior skipper's boat, did most of the ops for SIS and SOE. So that's the kind of way it was divided up between the boats. But the procedure is the same. Gunboats would aim for a predetermined point, a pinpoint off the coast. They would anchor, they would make contact with the shore party, ideally by radio, originally, or first time out, maybe with light signals. Certainly in the case of the Bonaparte operations, the first ones were by light signals, until they could land walkie-talkie radios. And then surf boats would be sent in. Or in the case of 502 and 503, I think they could carry actually 4 surf boats, which are 14 feet long, double-ended, normally crewed with 2 ratings rowing and a third man in the stern with a sweeping oar, plus a landing officer who usually went at the front, just the one landing officer to make contact with the reception party, make sure everything was kosher, I guess. So that's the system, that's the way it worked.
And just to jump in and talk about Brittany a bit, because for people who are watching who've never been to Brittany, and obviously I have and you have, we'll go back that previous map there. Obviously, any operation to rescue people from France has to be within the range of the southern ports. You can't do it, that too far down France because the distances become too involved. But Brittany, of course, I mean, it can't be Normandy because Normandy is full of Atlantic wall and it's a high security. It can't be Normandy. Brittany is ideal in a sense, lots of craggy coastline, lots of little remote places, but not that remote. That's the thing, because it had been an area of fishing and still is, and a certain amount of tourism. so many of the coastline do have roads, they do have harbors, there are buildings there, there are villages there, and of course, where there are harbors, there are people, and the Germans were there. The Germans weren't there necessarily in huge numbers. You go further down south into the next part of Brittany, you've got all the U-boat pens and the U-boat places as you go on towards the next part of France. So it's not an area the Germans are ignoring, but it's not an area they've got a huge amount of interest in. It's sort of somewhere in the middle, really, isn't it? I suppose, in terms of their importance. So it has qualities that are suitable for this, but also some dangers as well.
Some dangers? Are you kidding? It's got the highest tides in Europe. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to let you bring up the idea of that the tides is the big thing, isn't it? I mean, it's. Yeah, I'll hand it back to you to talk about the difficulty there, because anyone who's ever been to Mont Saint Michel, everyone knows that famously the tides there are 45 feet or something. It's from the high to low tide. It's incredible tides. They're incredibly strong, and so that must add an element of complication to this whole operation.
I think it made the trips interesting, and this is why you get the navigators are so essential. David Bergen's the best known, obviously. But Michael Salmon was right up there, I think, with him. These beaches were a nightmare. Bonaparte is probably the easiest one of all to find and to land. Compared with, well, Beg-en-Fry isn't too bad, but the Aber-Benoit, a nightmare, and just about all places in between. The various beaches were used to supply various intelligence networks, and they were dreadful. So dangerous, so difficult to find. The slightest error and your boat's going down, game over. Yeah, so, okay, we've covered landing officers. Now, you've been to Plage Bonaparte and you've seen the memorials, and they all say to Rezo Francois Shelburne. They don't just say Shelburne. So who was Francois? What does Francois refer to? Well, they were the lodgers and guides in Paris, organized by a man called Paul Campinci, who got mentioned earlier. And what an extraordinary guy. He's not mentioned in any of the Evader reports, and not that many books, to be honest. But he's one of the first contacts for Val Williams and Ray LaBrosse for Oak Tree. He didn't actually have much to do with them, and he was definitely unimpressed with Val Williams' sense of security, so he kept them at arm's length. But he knew all about it, and he certainly knew Ray LaBrosse, and it was his friend, who lived just around the corner from him, who let Ray LaBrosse use his sixth floor, I think it was, apartment for his radio to contact London. So Campinci knew all about Oak Tree and why it folded and all the rest of it. But he didn't have much to do with Oak Tree. So when Dumais and LaBrosse turned up in November, they were told not to contact Campinci because he was contaminated by Oak Tree. And it was believed in London that all the Oak Tree contacts had been rolled up. And to be fair, most of them were, but not Campinci. So, Lucien Dumais, platoon sergeant major with 1st Battalion Leave, Fusilier Mont-Royal, landed in Dieppe on 19th August and captured. He escaped a few days later, made his way to Marseille, where the Pat line got him out, as I've mentioned earlier, on Operation Rosalind from Calais-Plage. Ray LaBrosse, signalman, Royal Canadian Corps of Signals, recruited as the radio operator for Val Williams. So he'd been parachuted in, he knew the city, he knew Campinci, he knew how it worked, and he knew how hard it was to cross the Pyrenees, and I bet he did not want to do that again. So their first priority was to set up a secure base in Paris. They were landed by Lysander. That all went very smoothly indeed, made their way to Paris, but their contact there was Madame Georges, Lucienne Christiane Baudin. She and a friend, Suzanne Bosnia, actually worked with the Saint-Samson network, but they were the only contacts that London could supply them with. So they duly made contact and were staying in Madame Baudin's flat when the two ladies were arrested. So suddenly, Dumais and LaBrosse are homeless and have nowhere to go. No organization, no backup, no nothing. And I think it must have been in some desperation that LaBrosse went to see Campinci. And even that wasn't easy because he'd moved. But Campinci had his ear to the ground. He knew they were in town. He made contact with them, obviously became sufficiently impressed with Dumais to work with him, unlike Val Williams, who was distinctly unimpressed with. And so Rezo Francois was established with a whole network of helpers, everything an agent could ask for, really. They had contacts, they had false papers being printed up, they had security, some of the best security around, as good as Burgundy, let's put it that way, as professional. Mary Rose Zerling spoke fluent English, or American English. She was checking the identities of the airmen, and so on and so forth. So this was their perfect base in Paris. But they still needed a beach, say the second requirement, third requirement. And again, Campinci comes to the rescue. He's got contacts in Brittany, and he recommends they go and see a doctor who'd previously been in Paris, now based in Brittany, and he introduced them to the organization in Plage, Francois Cornec, etc., etc. And so it goes on. I forgot to mention, Campinci originally got involved because he'd helped an invader called Reginald Smith, an RAF crewman who'd been shot down, brought to his apartment. And Campinci's first experience was organizing Smith's evacuation by sea, eventually through Ernest Sibril, I believe, at Carantec. So Smith came back by fishing boat, along with a couple of American crewmen, and gave Campinci's name to London. So that's how he became involved and was known to MI9, so originally for Oak Tree and etc. So that's basically how it worked. Campinci had, well, I've written here, it was from my book, a long-held ambition of sending invaders direct to England by sea. His first-hand experience with Reginald Smith and then with Oak Tree, which basically failed because the delays meant the shortening nights made it impossible for a gunboat, had not dampened his enthusiasm. So when Le Brosse returned to Paris in November with Lucien Dumais, Campinci saw it as an opportunity to finally realize his dream. And I haven't made that up. I got that kind of information from Campinci's daughter, of all people. I mean, she knew. She was very young, but she was a part of it and, would have grown up with that.
And is there a type of person, a particular type of person who gets involved in this? Because obviously, you can't recruit by putting a notice in the local mairie saying wanted helpers for a new escape line. It's got to be based on trust and long knowledge of who you can approach about these things. But I mean, obviously Bretons, I know we're talking about Paris as well, but Bretons are very independent, stubbornly not the same as the rest of France. And so they're very, very stubborn. And I mean that in a good way. They're very independent, very determined to go about their way of life. But in all your studies of this, is there a type of quality that drew people to this kind of activity?
No, other than a determination to do the right thing.
Right.
And a certain courage, plus initiative to get it done. It's one thing wanting to do it, but being able to do it is a different thing.
Good point.
It's one thing for a family to take in an evading soldier or an airman, but to get it much further, you need organization or money or both and contacts. It's not an easy thing to do. Yeah. I don't think Campinci had much money, for example, but he did know a lot of people and they trusted him. So when he said, I need help, they were prepared to help. And when Dumais turned up, he had a lot of money and he was able to cover the costs, which were extensive. I mean, traveling by train, not cheap. Finding black food, which would have come off the black market, not cheap. Clothing, very short supply, not cheap, etc., etc. We're talking a lot of dosh here. And so put Campinci's organizational skills and the trust that people had in him with Dumais' money, and you've got yourself a going concern. And I think it would have been the same in Brittany. Francis Le Cornec was experienced in resistance. People knew him, people trusted him. So when he wanted people to run safe house, which is about all he needed, people came forward. He knew them. He ran a cafe. He knew everybody in Pleuc. He knew who he could trust. Don't think there were many he could not trust. I'm not aware of any collaborators in that area. So once Le Cornec was put in touch with Dumais, or the other way around, you had a pretty secure organization in Pleuc as well. And then they had Henri Leblay in Saint-Brieuc as a go-between for delivery from Paris to Saint-Brieuc, and then change trains to go to Pleuc for the first operation. So the organization, two groups really, Pleuc and Paris. That's the Shelburne part of it, the Francois Shelburne part, rather. The Francois in Paris, Shelburne, the overall. And then you've got other organizations which fed into mostly Paris, but also from Brittany, which is usually overlooked by people looking at Shelburne. So that's the kind of thing that I try to cover in the book. Francis Le Cornec and Joseph Mainguy, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, who was a Marine captain. They went to the beach suggested by London and decided that it wasn't going to work very well. And it was they and Pierre Huet who found Lance Conchet, the Bonaparte beach that was actually used. Yeah, they were seamen. They knew how this worked. They could understand that they needed a beach that they could get to quietly, that boats could land on, etc., etc. Without the people of Pleuc, this wouldn't have worked. Yeah, it wasn't a decision made by Dumais or anything. This was the local people finding that beach. And you've been there. I mean, you know, the beach itself is nice, at low tide anyway. The access is interesting, to say the least.
Well, I mean, I'm putting up some photos now. I mean, you couldn't make up this beach. It's like someone like Enid Blyton wrote it for a Secret Seven adventure. You know, it's kind of got everything you would need for a fictitious smuggler's cove, access only via a little tunnel. It's out of something like a pirate story, that, you know, and it, you know, the Germans were in the area, but it was deemed safe enough to be able to be used. And you know, I'm just going through the photos there. That's the access to one part of it, and you've got the other side of it. So tell us, you know, when they saw it for the first time, was it instant, this is the beach we're going to use?
That tunnel wasn't there, of course.
No, yeah, but now, I mean, visiting it now, I mean, yeah.
It was the best beach in that area. It's the only one accessible from Pleuc. Still, as you know, several miles north of Pleuc. It's a fair old schlep in the middle of the night, trying to be quiet. But it's a good beach. It's just the access was interesting.
Yeah.
Through that crumbly old cliff, which nobody's allowed to go down anymore, which is fair enough. You know, modern health and safety. Don't think that applied in 1944. So that was the risk that they took. But if you go back to 2 or 3 slides back, Pointe de la Tour, not very far north of there, there's a gun platform, and the remains are still there. I don't know if you went out there. Is it the second or third headland along? Yeah, I think it's only the second headland along Pointe de la Tour. There are big guns were sighted there.
Yeah, no, we always visit some Vides and when we went, because we went to the Bonaparte beach, and then later on we went to the Vides and the position, we realized they're not that far away. There are German positions really, really not that far away, although kind of round a corner a little bit, but that's only for being on the beach. That's not counting, you know, the approach from the sea, of course.
Yeah, the gunboats would be more or less off Pointe de la Tour. I can't remember the name of the rocks are, but they weren't that far away, and overlooked big time. If the light had been better, it's a risky old business. I said it was one of the easier beaches to pinpoint, to find, and all the rest of it, but it still wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't safe. So that's what we have. We have our gunboats, we have our organization in Paris, we have our organization in Pleuc, and we have a beach. What do you need? So the first operation, 16 airmen taken out on this first Bonaparte operation the night of 28-29 January 1944. 3 RAF, the rest Americans. All except Sam Blackwell passed through Paris from Rezo Francois. The other passenger was Oak Tree organizer Val Williams. He'd been captured as you presumably know, for some reason held at Rennes prison. I don't understand that one, the Jacques Cartier prison there, from which he escaped. Made his way to Paris. Rezo Francois people picked him up. And then he was brought out on the first Bonaparte operation. So a bonus for him. Some of the men brought into Francois' network by Mary Rose Zerling. She was a star and was very unfortunate to be captured fairly soon afterwards. But she had contacts with Bordeaux-Lupiac and the remnants of the John Carter organization. Bordeaux-Lupiac was a Camorres operating across northern France and down the western seaboard, actually. It was really a Breton organization, but with branches in the north as well. Well, that was, the Breton end was pretty much trashed with the death of Camorres. So it was the Bordeaux-Lupiac in the Pas de Calais that supplied King and St. Kosky. And the John Carter organization was also folded at the beginning of January when Carter was arrested at Pamiers, trying to take men into Switzerland. So they were at a loose end. They were stuck with Jean Huet and Margaret Schmitz, who were contacted via Mary Rose Zerling and hence on to Rezo Francois. So that's the way the links worked. These people knew each other. Gilbert Thibault also was a major player. He was collecting evaders from all around south and east of Paris and feeding them into the various organizations, including, in this case, Shelburne. So he previously associated with, and later, with Burgundy as well. But Shelburne was obviously a fast way back for the evaders, and Thibault knew it. So this was the best game in town. So they were brought from Paris to Saint-Brieuc, where they changed into the narrow gauge Le Tortinade, the tortoise train. Little tiny train. You've seen pictures of it, and there is a museum with the trains. I mean, it's a tiny little thing. Well, it's a fat little engine on tiny little wheels. Crawled along, stopped everywhere along the way. It must have taken hours to get to Pleuer. Anyway, and the 3 stops that will probably have been used in and around Pleuer for various safe houses. So the evaders would have been pulled off at various points and stashed away. But it was the changeover at Saint-Brieuc where they lost 2 evaders, Norman Mabey and Paul Sanders. They were stopped in a routine ticket check, I'm sure, but they were handed over to the Germans, and that was the end of the game. Everybody else got through quite safely. Were stashed away in Pleuer, in and around Pleuer, various safe houses. All of these are in the book and other books as well. But some of them were there for a couple of weeks, which is hazardous to say the least. You know, Pleuer was in the coastal zone. There were German troops in and around the area. It was not a great idea. And they realized it, I think, because it didn't happen again. After the first Bonaparte operations, overnight stops in Pleuer were reduced to an absolute minimum. So anyway, 16 airmen taken out, all except Sam Blackwell, brought from Paris. Blackwell is in most of the books. He was shot down in the sea off Brest somewhere and picked up by the Germans, escaped from a train taking him from Germany, made his way to somebody who could help him. I've got all the details, but I can't remember off the top of my head. And then one of whom took him to Guingamp for Christmas because they didn't know what to do with him. These people were not connected. But once in Guingamp, Mathurin Branchou heard all about it because he was a man with contacts, and he took on Blackwell, stashed him away with Désir and Francine Laurent, and then to Rennie and Helen Ranou's Cafe, and then Denise Lecomte, who played a major role, she and her son, in future operations from Guingamp. And at the last minute, Blackwell was taken to Pleuer to join the other airmen and was shipped out with them. And it was this first operation where you have the famous radio message, "Bonjour tout le monde à la Maison d'Alphonse." Now, a lot of controversy about the origins of that, what it meant, blah, blah, blah. I stick to the theory that it was a routine, random message that meant nothing.
Yeah.
I don't see any significance in it. I think like every other message personnel that the BBC sent, it had a special meaning, a significance for somebody, but nothing else. And I think this was agreed in advance with Dumeil and Labrosse. I could be wrong, but that's my theory. But
Makes sense to me.
on hearing it, the Maison d'Alphonse suddenly became the last little safe house, Jean Gicot's little pad near Saint-Samson, close to the beach, was adopted as the Maison d'Alphonse, and that's how it's been known ever since. So everybody's stashed away there, and that evening, invaders collected from various safe houses around Pleuc, walked through the night, side roads, paths. You can imagine what that was like, because you've been there again. You couldn't use the main road. I had no idea what paths they used. Find their way to Saint-Samson, at which point they would have a pep talk from Dumeil, top secret, blah, blah, blah. Absolute quiet, no smoking, no singing, etc. It took all their French money off them and then walked them single file down to the beach and down that horrible little cliff, including Val Williams, who was on a stretcher. Well, up to that point, at least. I don't know if they took the stretcher down the cliff or not. Probably not.
And whichever way you get down there, whether you're going down the modern roads that are there now or tracks or over, what struck me when I was down there is that if it all goes wrong when you're down there, there's no way of getting out again. If the Germans were to encroach on their area from inland, they can position themselves on a few places, and you're caught. Fish in a barrel. It's very usefulness as being a beach that was kind of in the middle of nowhere for evacuation was that if one of these routes was, if they were discovered en route down there or afterwards, or a light was seen, it could have gone really badly wrong.
They would have been toast. I mean, game over. Absolutely, no question. And whether the gunboat would have been spotted and fired upon is a separate matter. But either way, we're talking dangerous stuff here. They make it sound simple, but it really wasn't. The risks were huge. Don't underestimate these.
And another question for you, because you hinted at it quite early in the presentation about the lady in Paris who has to kind of check the stories of the evaders, because there are these airmen coming in there, British ones, American ones, various other nationalities, because we know that the Germans are trying to infiltrate all sorts of resistance networks across Europe by putting in people, either their own agents or they've converted people from the nation. So obviously, by the time anyone gets to Pleuc, they have been thoroughly vetted and been through all the process. But in Paris, do you know of anybody who was discovered as being not what they purported to be at that? Were there any attempts made to break into this?
The only one that we know about is Olaf, the supposed Norwegian blah, 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 with the most ludicrous stories that nobody believed. I don't know of any professional infiltration agents that tried to get into Shelburne or Francois. I don't think so. I think their security was tight enough that nobody knew to target them.
Yeah.
Olaf was an outlier, just a strange guy. I don't believe he's responsible for any betrayals. I think he was just a weird guy trying his luck and hoping to get to England, which he did not. I don't know what happened to him later. But Margaret Schmitz, for instance, who was arrested, does not believe that he was the man responsible. And I'll take her word for it. She was a smart cookie, an elderly lady who really went through the ringer. Thank you very much to the Malice guys. But she still maintains that it wasn't him. I only have her word for it, but there's no evidence to suggest that he worked for anybody else.
Okay,
or that he
thank
was
you.
Right. Picked up 16 guys, plus Val Williams, stashed them on the gunboat and cruised back to Dartmouth without incident. I've got here a perfect operation. So, second operation, a month later, 26th, 27th of February, 1944. The most important thing, I suppose, significant thing, is just after first operation, the little Tortillard Railway was closed to public transport, public use, taken over by the organisation Todd for building defences, etc., etc. So that made Saint-Brieuc pretty much redundant. they decided they'd have to go on to Guingamp, so all they did at Saint-Brieuc was literally change trains from the express train to a more local train, which could drop the invaders at Guingamp. And Guingamp really gets overlooked in most of the books. And yet, as far as I'm concerned, Guingamp was every bit as important to the success of Shelburne as those in Pleuc are. In some ways, even more so. They've been a centre of resistance throughout the war. Guingamp is away from the coastal zones, less heavily patrolled, and it had links to groups all over Brittany, whereas Pleuc was unknown. Nothing had happened in Pleuc, to my knowledge, until Shelburne came along. But Guingamp was a centre, as I say, and people were stashed away there for significant amounts of time and had been throughout the war. So Guingamp was the logical place for invaders to be gathered before they were taken to Pleuc and Plage Bonaparte. This is where you get Francois Carambrun's truck being utilised to take invaders from Guingamp to Pleuc, although usually it was Jean Trifol that drove it rather than Francois himself. So at this point, the operation itself was fairly straightforward, fairly similar to, all five are fairly similar from a gunboat point of view. But we start getting into individual stories, which is what the book's really about. I base it around invaders, but that gives me the opportunity to introduce as many helpers as possible. The whole point of these books, my articles, my websites, is about the helpers. So, but some of the invaders are extraordinary in their own right. So, especially Lee Gordon. You've read about Lee Gordon. B-17 ball turret gunner shot down off Wilhelmshaven on 26 February 1943. He and the rest of the crew were captured, but he alone escaped from Moosburg. Third attempt. Second one, I've got it in the book, disguised as a member of the Hitler Youth. Custom-made lederhosen, cycled out of the camp. Didn't get very far, but what a fantastic idea. Anyway, he finally made it and made his way to northeast border town, which I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, where he was picked up by the Jean-Marie Escape Line. Now, that belonged to SOE agent Henri Frager. They got him to Paris, and then he was passed on to Pierre Hentic and the Jade Fitzroy crew. This is the same organisation in the extreme west of Brittany that organised the gunboats from Aberbennois. But that ended with Hentic's arrest in early January, so Gordon was passed to Yves Le Hennef and his Dahlia organisation. Now, that was a great idea, and he was stashed away on a boat called the Jouet des Flots, which was probably shipwrecked. So Lee Gordon is back to square one. Somehow finds his way back to Paris, at which point contacts originally with Dahlia put him in contact with, I think it was through the Morans family, with Rezo Francois. And so he's added to the list there. And then we've got Harry Minor and John Seamack, two of my favourite invaders. They really went through the ringer. Both shot down on 16th of September. Seamack taken to Rennes, where he missed out on the Bordeaux-Lupiac sea evacuation following the death of Jean-Claude Camor. While Minor missed out on being taken to Paris and passed on to Burgoyne because he wasn't an officer. And then both being left behind when the remaining officer in their party was taken to St. Cast for a VAR line operation. And they got left behind yet again. They finally found their way onto the organisation in Brest, which is a major operation. The organisation there it's seldom reported on, but so impressive. And then you've got the 6 crewmen from Slow Time Sally. Again, you've read the book, but their adventures in Britain and Finisterre, along with Minor and Seamack, they almost deserve a book of their own. But I haven't written that one yet. So the men collected in Paris were brought to Guingamp in 2 parties. Leon Hamel, Belgian fighter pilot, and Lee Gordon's arrival is well documented. Everybody covers that. After they got drunk in Guingamp, missed their guide, blah, 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 etc., etc. But the other 4 men brought from Paris, no problem, stashed away in around Guingamp for the day, and then joined a group of invaders brought from Brest and stashed away in Pommery-le-Vicomte, which is northeast of Guingamp, sort of on the way to Pleuc, but it spread the safe houses out a bit. and then they were distributed in various savers around until the following evening. They were collected by local guides and taken to the Maison d'Alphonse. So very little time in Pleurs, just one night in Pleurs before they went out to Plage Bonaparte, collected by surf boats, rowed out to the gunboat. It's exactly the same from the gunboat's point of view as the first operation. Bonaparte 3 was a change to this one. This is quite different. For some reason or other, Mathurin Branchou decided not to use Guingamp, and nobody seems to understand why. I mean, nobody understands why. He wanted to take them to Châtellaudren, which is on the way to Guingamp, between Saint-Brieuc and Guingamp. But it's a stupid place in many ways. It's so tiny that the invaders stood out like sore thumbs. The station isn't even in the village. It's out on a limb, by itself. So there were controls there. And nobody can understand the logic of this. But he did it. And so the invaders were taken to Châtellaudren. It's also the only Bonaparte operation where 502 was used rather than 503. So the skipper was Peter Williams, but not David Birkin. Come back to that a bit later. So this was Peter Williams at 502 with Michael Salmond as his navigator, because 503 with Birkin was working for VAR that night, or the following night. He was on a VAR line operation. I won't try and describe the various evasions in any detail because life's too short, but most of them involve the organization in Beauvais. Again, not mentioned anywhere else, but a very impressive organization, which you really should know about. But also Joe Birdwell, who could have gone out on the first operation. Thanks a lot. But he worked with Mary Rose Zerling at interviewing invaders. I'm really sorry about this. We've got a visitor here who doesn't know I'm doing this.
Okay.
Checking security on the various invaders and delayed his own departure. Can you excuse me just a second? I am really sorry about this.
I'll talk without you. Don't worry. For a minute.
Absolutely. This just splits.
The perils of live TV, folks. So this is fantastic stuff we're giving you now. So just a reminder that tomorrow's show with Sarah Louise Miller, which is going to be about the planning for Operation Chastise Dam Bust, it's temporarily postponed. Probably fit in around May the 30th, something like that. I will get that amended. I have put up the shows for next week for our artillery week. I've had to shuffle a couple of them around, but we're also finally getting round to the presentation about Stalingrad with Ian McGregor, that was originally scheduled for, I think, February, and then for various reasons we've not been able to find a date that Ian and I are both available, but we are finally able to do that. That will be next week on whichever day it is, Friday in the morning, that one there. So that's really cool. So that one about Stalingrad, and then we're going to work on the next batch of shows, which will be after that. So it's artillery week next week, but trying to get some of the ones that we haven't been able to get to and reschedule them. So that's fantastic. So I think Keith is back, so I'll bring him back in. So there we go. The perils of live TV. It's lots of fun, though.
Yeah, sorry about that. You're probably at the end of the story by now. No, Bonaparte 3, yes. 503. We've got Joe Birdwell, young navigator, shot down over the Pas de Calais, helped by a whole group of people, but teamed up with Mary Rose Zerling. And the pair of them were checking on invaders all around Paris to make sure they were genuinely American. And he stayed on. After Mary Rose Zerling was arrested, he stayed on for much longer and didn't go out until the end of March, where he could have gone out at the end of January if he'd so chosen. So, good man. I think he actually wound up working with MI6 after the war.
Wow.
Or towards the end of the war, rather. I believe that's true. And we also have an undercover agent with possible pseudonym or nom de guerre of Fifi. I'm not sure about that. I may have made that up. But who would have suspected a German shepherd of leading American airmen through German-occupied France? What a cover story. So the first 14 men to be taken off on this operation were brought from Paris to Châtellaudren in 3 groups over 2 days, and then driven to Pleurs on the evening of 14 March to be sheltered in and around the town for 2 nights before the night of departure. and along with two more Americans, Jack McGough and Ralph Patton, who were already in Brittany. Their story is complicated. You really need to read the book. And Patton is particularly interesting because I know his daughter. I've known her for about 20 years, and she sent me a lot of detail on that and introduced me to somebody else who had even more details on Brittany. Again, perhaps Beverly's version of events isn't unique. I'm sure she's spoken to other people, but the contacts she gave me, Yvonne Miller and Doug Doyle, their input is unique and very special. And I think it makes the book a bit different to most. This is also the operation which almost went pear-shaped. For some reason, just after the operation was due to take place, or just before rather, security was suddenly increased. Fishermen were banned from sailing. Everything was shut down. And Dumais was trying to cancel the operation, but just didn't have time. It was the last minute. He couldn't get a radio message to England. He couldn't get La Brosse back to Paris in time. He couldn't get decent coverage for his radio from Pleur. And then when the gunboat was approaching, there was gunfire. And everybody, well, they didn't panic because they weren't those kind of people, but they didn't know what was going on. The gunboat pulled back. And then an hour or so later, they radioed in saying they'd returned. And the operation went off smooth as silk after that. Oh, touch and go, because it was getting a bit light by the time they finally set sail. And then a few nights later, we had Bonaparte 4. 3 nights later. Because of this short turnaround time, invaders could be brought straight from Paris onto Brittany with a minimum delay. John McGlynn and the 4 men who invaded in Brittany, and apart from John McGlynn rather than the other 4, the other 12 invaders were all sheltered in Chorney. Again, another organisation which is overlooked, including Paul Dickon, who'd earlier been helped by Princess Charlotte of Monaco. I don't think you'll read that anywhere else. Rather special. And all of them were helped by the organisation in Creole. Again, another organisation which very few people know about. They just don't get the credit they deserve, but they operated throughout the war. Superb. So both groups of 6 brought from Paris were taken to Château-Laudron, walked to a farm, including those taken by Fifi, of course, and then collected by truck, which already had the other 5 invaders who'd been sheltered in or brought to Guingamp, and driven straight to Pleur on the night of their departure. They didn't even stay overnight. They were met on the edge of town by various guides, local guides, and walked to the Maison d'Alfort. At which point, Dumais tried to abandon the subsequent operations. Told Le Cornec that he'd sent La Brosse to Paris to cancel them. Le Cornec didn't think this was going to work. So he'd seen La Brosse operating his radio before and not getting through. But Dumais said, well, if it goes ahead, you can run it, but I'm going to Paris. And he was actually in Guingamp waiting for the bus to get to Paris when the radio signal came through saying that that operation was going to go ahead. This is also the operation where the only soldier brought back by Shelburne, Bulan Khan, Indian Army cook, being captured right at the early stages of the war, and for some reason wound up at Rennes, a sort of POW camp, come hospital camp at Rennes, from where he was rescued by a lady called Lise Thoraider. He was on the same boat, the Jouet de Flots, Lee Gordon. He doesn't mention his report, but he was definitely there when they were shipwrecked. And he found his own way back to his previous helpers, who then made contact with the people in Guingamp, who latched him on to the Shelburne line. He was extremely lucky. Very strange story.
Wow.
And it's also the one operation which landed 2 agents brought in, Michel Bourgeois and Martin Mary, radio operators, who went off to support Burgoyne. So it's the only operation I know that landed any agents. And then Bonaparte 5 recorded 26 Allied airmen, all of whom went through Paris before being taken by train back to Guingamp. They'd given up on Château-Laudron. 4 parties over 3 days, stopping briefly at Guingamp before being taken to Pleur and Plage Bonaparte. They also took out Jean Trehu, one of the Shelburne workers' helpers in Pleur. and Raymond Labouris from the organisation in Brest. His father and sister were also involved in this stuff. And a Dahlia agent called Andre Can. Not in the book, because I didn't know it at the time. It is on the
website with the amendments. Yeah.
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
a quick question, Gary, from Gary for you, Keith, about the time scales. We're up to Bonaparte 5 now, but I mean, in terms of the gunboat and then the embarkation and working around the tides, how long were they all about the same length of time? How long did the operation take?
The theory was to be an absolute minimum time on the beach. That was about the only thing they could control. So they tried for something like a 10-minute turnaround, which is going some. And on this last operation, they couldn't do that because there were too many men. They had to send the boat back again. The approach would have been done at night, obviously, moonless night. The navigation would have been fairly straightforward. They seemed to arrive around between 12 and 1. Anchored off their pinpoint, made contact. It would take a bit of time to launch the surf boats and row them in, but the pickup time from the beach seems to be around about 2 o'clock. That's what they're aiming for. And then call it an hour to get to the beach and back again and set off long before dawn. That didn't always happen, obviously. Certainly Bonaparte 3, they were really pushing their luck to get out before it got light, but that was the plan. So the idea is to do the whole thing in the dark if you could. I believe the pinpoint off Bonaparte was fairly easy to find, comparatively easy to find. So they'd have had all the times worked out in advance. So yeah, it's pretty much set what they tried to do. And if they succeeded, then great. And if it didn't, they played it by ear. Yeah, this is the operation where the quickest turnaround for a return to the UK by an Allied airman. Kenneth Woodhouse, 8 days after he bailed out over northern France, he was back in England.
Yeah, so that's the story. I think that was one of my takeaways, is that how quick it could be, and at the other end of the scale, how long it could take. I mean, you mentioned your father was sort of 16 months, or that was earlier in the. I mean, it's the amount of people, the amount of people involved in this, all these different networks, all these different communities, all these different locations, all squirreling away during their part of this process, and and not enough of them getting the credit. But 8 days yes, it's your bed is almost still warm when you get back. It's your tea's still warm on the sideboard.
That was an extraordinary record. I believe it is the record. Yeah. I mean, you're pushing your luck to even find an organisation in 8 days. I mean, some people did, but one that can actually get you out of the country in that time is truly extraordinary. Yeah, I don't know what the longest evasion would be. You could probably count Lee Gordon as a contender, from being shot down to escaping from Germany. One of the very, very few Americans who escaped from Germany. I mean, it's embarrassing. I know that they like to pretend they were part of the Great Escape, etc., etc. The number of Americans who escaped from Germany or German POW camps is tiny. I think I've only got 3. I mean, it's ridiculous. So Lee Gordon was a bit of a trendsetter there, and a long-term evasion and very complex, but I doubt it's the record. So you're talking months and sometimes more than a year for some of these evasions. So even not counting soldiers who were stashed away and quite comfortable for a while. Like my dad was actually quite comfortable for most of the time he was stashed away. So I don't know what the record is, and I don't know how you would actually define that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Anyway, as far as I know, Kenneth Woodhouse the quickest, and this also included William Locke and Charlie Mullins. They were shot down over Holland, which is apart from Lee Gordon, is the furthest distance of any of the evaders to travel, brought out on Shelburne. So they were shot down over Holland, and they were helped by, eventually, Dutch Paris, who got them, ironically enough, as far as Paris before the safe house was blown or raided. And they and 6 other guys managed to get away, thanks to a lot of help from the Dutch Paris helpers, and finally found their way to Rezo Francois. But it was more luck than judgment, I think. That they switched from Dutch Paris to Shelburne and were brought out. Again, I don't actually know how the link is. the people they describe as making the connection between Dutch Paris or their stray odyssey after Dutch Paris don't tie up with any descriptions of Rezo Francois people that I can name.
Right.
I just don't know who they were, but they wound up with Rezo Francois and were brought out on this fifth operation. So that's your 5 Bonaparte operations. From a gunboat point of view, straightforward, apart from 3 where they had this delay with the gunfire. Everything else went smooth as silk. The rest of the story, which everybody likes to include, are the Crozier operations. As far as I'm concerned, they're different. They're not part of the Shelburne story, really, although they involved Shelburne people.
And I think then, therefore, Keith, that would be a good thing to rejoin in a future show and talk about that and expand on that, and perhaps expand on some of the work you've been doing on this whole study. And we're an hour and 10 minutes now, and turn it over to a few questions from the viewers, if that's okay with you, because I think we'll do that. I mean, it's been amazing, and again, I'll remind you folks that you can get the book there and check out the website, because there's you've only hinted at some of these personal stories, because I mean the variety of escapades these people got through is extraordinary. I mean, the network was about ferrying human people from all sorts of different situations. But while we're waiting for a couple of questions to come in, obviously one of the things I admired about your website is you have your amendments, things you've learned since you did the book, things you're continuing to study. Members of family members have contacted you via the website from across the globe. I says from France. So where are you in understanding this story? Are there any real nagging things that you still haven't determined? You've mentioned a few times that haven't quite connected up some of the dots on this. Is there anything really big nagging you, or have you got most of it sort of sorted out now?
On Shelburne?
Yeah, Shelburne.
I don't know where else to go. There are odd bits and pieces. There are helpers who are not identified. There are helpers who may have a name, but I don't know anything about them. And I don't know where else to go for that. I'm working on other projects as well, other escape line stuff. So I haven't pursued to the ends of the earth everything. But if I came up with any ideas, I would follow them. I don't know where else to go with Shelburne. I think I've covered everything I can.
Well, we got a good question from Sean Brennan here. Were the helpers recognized post-war for their heroic efforts? Obviously, some of them you haven't identified who they were, but were they recognized by the British or the French or anybody? Obviously, we've seen those photos up of the plaques that acknowledge the lines and the network. But in terms of it on an individual basis?
Yes. There's a lot of work done by IS9 after the war. There is a register of, I think it's about 12,000 French names. Many of them were recognized with awards. There's a sort of grading system, 1 through 5, if you like, certificate 17s, and something like MBEs, OBEs, a few George Crosses, the whole bit. Not everybody, it's hard to know how they got on this register. Some are obvious. They're named by evaders. We know their stories. We know they're legitimate. We know they did extraordinary things. There are some names on there which we can't be sure about, and some are plainly, bogus, frankly. But the vast, vast majority are people who genuinely contributed. And, of course, some of the people who genuinely contributed were not found, did not volunteer. They're not on the list. But 10 to 12,000 would be about right, I would guess.
Well, I mean,
so there are a lot of files.
Yeah.
I believe there are helper files, but they're in the US for some reason. It's the Americans that have a list, actual files of them. I have the list of the names, and I have some details and a fair number of details of awards and the recommendations for awards. So they give you some brief details on many of the people. And I've used the information from that in the Shelburne and Burgoyne stories, of course.
Okay. I think you've kind of half covered this, but maybe you will address it anyway. Gary August is asking, were there any notable German successes against the network which affected its operational capability?
Nope, not one.
Yeah.
Security was first class.
I mean, the other thing is, when I was down in Brittany on this particular trip, and I was going through places like Dinan and what have you, there are later on in 44, in June, from the Bonaparte operations, there are massacres of people. There are people who are connected with the resistance who are murdered in forests, things like that. So it's not an area that avoided repercussions for resistance activity, not necessarily connected at all with the Shelburne line, but it is an area where there is a German presence. And if you are doing something against their occupation or seeming to be actively supporting allies, you can get stopped, you can get shot, you can be deported or worse. So there are stories that are in that area that are demonstrating a fierceness about the German response to underground activity, shall we say.
Absolutely, but I don't think it has anything to do with the area. I think it's more a question of the right people who were not armed, they weren't being aggressive, and they just about got away with carrying out their operations before the build up to D-Day. So that's what I think. There wasn't much in the way of resistance activity. They didn't blow up any railways. They didn't get involved in any of that stuff. They were under the radar generally, and the same in Paris. They weren't involved in intelligence gathering or any of that. They were actually supposedly banned from it, although it did happen. They stuck to what they were doing, which wasn't that much of a threat to the Germans, although they did like to infiltrate escape lines.
Okay. A couple more questions. Kyle is asking, were there any monetary rewards for those assisting downed airmen? Now, I mean, in various occasions, MI9 are funding various causes within France. But if you were a helper, were you assisted financially? You talked about the difficulty of getting rations, the difficulty of getting clothing. Was there some way of getting expenses paid, so to speak?
No. If you were part of a big organization, the organizations themselves would have had money. Excuse me. Francois Dizard was collecting money from Switzerland to run her organization. A lot of expenses. Lucien Dumay had a lot of money brought in on gunboats. It's not clear how he distributed. There is some disquiet about his parsimony, I think would be the right word, about the way he spread the dosh around. But the most a helper rather could expect was expenses. There was some recompense after the war if people were deported or killed, executed. There was some compensation and sometimes a pension in recognition of the contributions they made. But basically it was expenses. That's it.
Okay. So the last one, and I'm gonna word it slightly differently. So Peter O'Connell is asking, to the extent many resistance nets got compromised, how compartmentalized were the Brittany nets from the others? And I think I'm going to go back to what I was saying about Brittany very much being a separate part of France. You were talking about these people that came from Paris. They had to be known and trusted by someone, a proper, true Breton within Brittany, because it's a place where outsiders they're not treated with distrust, but it's a very, very independent region. Do you think that helped with keeping security better in Brittany than perhaps other parts of France?
Possibly. Using the word resistance is a bit.
I know. Okay.
It wasn't resistance with a capital R.
No, it's covert operations. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing we've talked about on this channel before with Dr. Chris Millington. The use of the words resistance and collaboration. He prefers defiance and accommodation. And these people are being defiant of the regime without necessarily doing what we would consider resistance activities, as you said yourself, blowing up trains, so to speak. But but Brittany has a bit of an independence that helped.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I can't remember what the Breton name for the local resistance group was until he got busted. Hardheads it translates to. Pen Khaled, which in Breton I believe just means hardheads, to recognize their obstinacy to the German occupation. They hated being ruled by anybody. Paris was bad,
exactly. They didn't really like being French or British or German. No. The Bretons, I mean, it's the only, if you haven't been to that part of the world, France, folks, it's the only part, one of the parts of France where the road signs are in two languages. They're in French and they're in Breton, and they have their own flag, the black and white flag. You can look it up online, folks. Colin, my friend, has one hanging in his living room because he often goes and sees the football down in when Caen go down and play Guingamp or whatever. So it is a very fiercely independent region. Think Cornwall, a bit like Cornwall in England, or possibly kind of, Cajun country in Louisiana, very, very separate from the areas around it. So I think the Bretons are a unique. But I love going down there. But I stick out like a sore thumb anyway because I'm English. But Mag, my other half, who's Norman, she sticks out in Brittany because she's clearly not from Brittany. She speaks French, but she's not a local. So it is a very, very different place. A bit like Basque. Someone says it's a bit like the Basque region of Spain. Similar, yeah.
But Pleur is only on the eastern extremes of Brittany.
Yeah, and it's not even the heart of Brittany, is it? It's like lowland Scotland compared to Highland Scotland. But anyway, we're going into a rabbit hole there. Keith, I'm going to extend the invitation for you to come back a second time and continue this story and perhaps talk about some of the other escape lines you worked on because people are finding it fascinating. And frankly, we can't find this information anywhere else. So did you enjoy chatting to our hardy bunch?
I did. Yeah, it gives me a chance to talk my favourite subject. Sorry if
we can tell you enjoy talking about it. So, folks, I will invite Keith back again. I've got nothing tomorrow, but first Friday we have the show same time where we are looking for a missing Halifax bomber with Rob Wagner. I'm looking forward to that one. So, folks, thanks for watching. Don't forget to click like the channel, click subscribe, and if you want to give us a little thank you in terms of remuneration, that'd be very well received. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, viewers. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
See ya.